began as most horrors do, with the sound of laughter echoing across candlelit halls. The year was 1934, and the village of Blackmere lay buried beneath a curtain of mist and propriety, the sort of English countryside where gossip was softer than rain, and tragedy, when it came, arrived politely. At the edge of town stood Renford Manor, a sprawling Georgian estate whose windows rarely glowed after dusk. Its owner, Mrs. Ada Renford, was a widow of impressive wealth and sharper reputation, known for her lavish dinner gatherings where local elites would dine beneath portraits that watched too closely. It was during one such evening that death made its first appearance, silent, unannounced, and perhaps invited. The guests had eaten heartily that night. Roast duck glazed with honey and rosemary, pickled turnips, sweetbread pudding, every course prepared by Mrs. Renford's loyal maid, Elsie Marrow. By morning, one guest, Mr. Benedict Clark, was found dead in his bed, his face described by the coroner as peaceful, but wrong somehow, his eyes open, his lips faintly tinted gray. The verdict was heart failure. The villagers mourned, then moved on. But death came again, and again, each time following another supper at Renford Manor. Elsie Marrow was 22, small, and nearly translucent in her gentleness. Born to a seamstress and raised in the parish orphanage, she spoke in whispers and moved like a ghost afraid to disturb the living. Her co-workers described her as devout and obedient, though some noticed she never ate the food she prepared. They said she hummed softly while cooking, a tune no one could identify, and always ended her meals with a prayer, murmured in words no one recognized. When the fifth guest died within a month, the town's peace began to rot. People crossed the street to avoid the manor gates. Church bells tolled longer than they should have. Whispers spread that the Renford cook had made a pact, that she stirred her ingredients under moonlight, that no animal ever entered her kitchen twice. One gardener swore he saw her pouring something from a dark bottle into a steaming pot, her eyes reflecting the fire like two pieces of glass. The police arrived in February, searching for poison, for toxins, for anything remotely criminal. They found nothing, not in the cupboards, nor in the cellar, nor in the spotless kitchen that smelled faintly of lavender, and something metallic beneath it. But in the far corner, on a high wooden shelf, stood an empty jar labeled in delicate handwriting, Preserve Number 13. The newspapers seized the story, branding her the gentle cook of death. Neighbors called her an angel, others a witch, but none could explain how so many had died without a trace of poison, nor why the death stopped the moment Elsie vanished. To this day, her recipes remain locked in evidence archives, untouched, unread, and waiting. Some say she cooked for the devil himself. Others believe she fed the lonely souls of the dead. But perhaps in her silence, Elsie was only following orders from something older than hunger. Before the first death, before the newspapers arrived with their ink-stained fingers and sensational headlines, there was only Blackmere, a place too small for ambition and too proud for change. Hidden between the rolling fields of Hampshire, it was a village suspended in time, the sort of place where the church bells divided the hours and the scent of peat and rain hung in the air like memory. Everyone knew everyone, or at least believed they did. They knew which farmers cheated the market scales, which wives prayed for forgiveness more than love, and which children were born too soon after weddings. Yet when Elsie Marrow stepped off the carriage in the summer of 1929, she came from nowhere, a ghost with luggage too small to hold a life. Her reference letter was written in a delicate, unfamiliar hand, recommending her for all domestic service, with a good heart and pious temperament. No one ever discovered who wrote it. The address at the bottom, a London parish, didn't exist, but Mrs. Ada Renford was not a woman easily deterred by oddities. She believed in intuition over investigation, and when she first saw Elsie, quiet, pale, her hair tied back like a novice nun, she decided, as she later told a friend, "This one will not steal from me." Renford Manor was enormous, an architectural relic from a century when families like the Renfords still mattered. Its walls smelled of polish and memory. Its corridors stretched so long they seemed to echo thoughts back at you. Ada, recently widowed, required both order and obedience, traits Elsie carried like perfume. Within days, the girl had memorized every shelf, every clock's peculiar rhythm, every sound the old house made in the wind. To the other servants, she was unnerving. She spoke softly, but when she looked at you, it felt like she could see not your face but the thought behind it. The cook, Mrs. Penfield, once joked that Elsie moved like she's counting her breaths, and perhaps she was. Her work was flawless, her manners devout. She crossed herself before cooking, whispered grace over boiling water, and kept a small wooden cross tied to her apron string. But sometimes she hummed while she worked, not hymns, but strange looping tunes that made the hairs rise on the nape of one's neck. In her first months at the manor, nothing remarkable happened. Blackmere remained as dull and predictable as its weather. The vicar preached about the wages of sin, the grocer complained about taxes, and Ada Renford's dinner parties began again. Those who attended would later recall that something had changed about the meals, not their taste, which was exquisite, but their atmosphere. Guests felt drowsy, heavy-limbed, their minds unanchored from conversation. It was as though the food itself had taken something from them, a small measure of will or warmth. When the first guest remarked upon it, joking that Elsie must be putting dreams in the pudding, she only smiled and said, "Dreams don't keep, sir." There are few surviving records from Elsie's early life, and most are inconsistent. The parish in which she was supposedly raised burned down in 1931, destroying its baptism books. A census listed her as missing when she would have been 14. One nun, Sister Agatha of St. Clement's Orphanage, remembered a quiet child with an appetite for prayer but little understanding of mercy. Agatha claimed Elsie used to sneak into the chapel after dark, touching the altar and whispering to the shadows behind the crucifix. She asked questions no child should, the nun said in her final interview before her death in 1950. She asked what happens when God stops listening. To the villagers of Blackmere, however, Elsie represented everything good about their way of life. A young woman with no vices, no opinions, no family to shame her. She attended church every Sunday, head bowed, eyes closed longer than anyone else's during prayer. The vicar often praised her from the pulpit as proof that discipline can sanctify even the lowest born. Yet there were those who found her piety excessive. One grocer's wife recalled how Elsie would pause outside the butcher's every morning, murmuring a blessing for the beasts that bled for us. Others noticed that birds never perched near her window, and that the stray cats who lingered around the manor would vanish overnight. By 1931, Elsie had become indispensable to Mrs. Renford. She cooked, managed accounts, and oversaw the other servants with quiet authority. Yet she kept no friends. When the housemaid, Clara Evans, attempted to share tea with her one evening, she found Elsie staring into an unlit stove, her lips moving soundlessly. Clara asked what she was saying. "Just asking forgiveness," Elsie replied, "for what hasn't happened yet." Clara never spoke to her again. Psychologists examining the case decades later would call Elsie a textbook example of cognitive dissonance under servitude, a woman who internalized obedience so completely that she ceased to recognize the line between virtue and control. Yet those who lived with her sensed something deeper, a stillness that was not peace, but restraint. Mrs. Penfield once described her as a teapot always just before boiling. The manor itself seemed to respond to her presence. Clocks ran slower, fires burned lower. Even Mrs. Renford, a woman of rational mind, confessed in a letter to her sister that she sometimes woke in the night to the sound of footsteps in the pantry. Soft, deliberate, like someone pacing between shelves. Each time she investigated, the room was empty, but the smell of spices and vinegar clung to the air. And then there was the pantry book. Every housekeeper kept one, a small ledger noting recipes, ingredients, and expenses. Elsie's entries began normally: flour, sugar, salt, lard. But by 1932, her handwriting had changed, tighter, more elaborate. She added odd entries like tincture of stillness, sleeping honey, and one whisper of grace. When asked what these were, she explained that they were just words to keep balance. The book later vanished, believed burned in the fire that consumed part of the manor years after her disappearance. In retrospect, the warning signs were everywhere, but Blackmere was a village that did not question devotion. To doubt a servant like Elsie would have been to doubt the system itself. Faith, hierarchy, obedience. Instead, they admired her. Mothers pointed her out to their daughters as a model of humility. The vicar cited her patience as proof of divine order. Even the children, who usually feared servants, followed her when she walked through town, drawn to the soft rhythm of her humming. But something was shifting beneath the calm surface. Guests began to describe an unease during their visits to the manor. They would return home and dream of corridors too narrow to escape, of doors that led back into themselves. The food was always exquisite, but after eating, several reported feeling not tired, but emptied. One visitor, a physician from London, confessed to his wife that he felt as though he had left something of himself on the plate. It was also around this time that Ada Renford's health began to decline. She suffered from night sweats, tremors, and a recurring nightmare of being buried alive beneath her own dining table. Dr. Emerson, the town's physician, blamed nerves. Ada blamed Elsie's overzealous piety. She wrote in her diary that the girl's prayers feel less like gratitude and more like reminders. When confronted, Elsie merely smiled and said, "Madam, some blessings are heavier than others." In one chilling account recorded by a maid named Dora Halley, Elsie was seen late one night standing in the manor garden under the full moon, barefoot in the frost. In her hands she held a bowl of milk. She poured it slowly onto the soil and whispered, "For those still hungry." Dora swore the next morning that every flower bed had withered overnight. The soil turned black and hard. The villagers began to talk, though always behind closed doors. They said Elsie had brought something with her, something that waited. Old women crossed themselves when she passed, and men avoided her gaze. Still, Ada Renford defended her. "If she is strange," she told the vicar, "it is only because the rest of us are dull." By the end of 1933, the air around Blackmere had grown heavy, as though the entire village were holding its breath. The manor's windows glowed late into the night. From the road, travelers claimed they could hear the sound of knives tapping plates long after supper had ended, and when the wind blew from the east, it carried the faint scent of burnt sugar and iron. In March, a letter arrived at the parish office addressed to no one in particular. The handwriting matched the style of Elsie's pantry book, delicate, curling, feminine. It read, "There is a peace in feeding others even when they cannot taste it. Some hungers are not of the stomach, and some recipes must be obeyed." The letter was unsigned. The vicar burned it immediately, but the memory of it remained, circulating like rumor through the pews of Blackmere Church. Looking back, the village would come to realize that the deaths at Renford Manor did not begin suddenly. They were prepared, simmered, measured in silence long before anyone took their first fatal bite. Elsie's arrival had not been chance. It had been the first ingredient. For some, she was a girl blessed with grace. For others, she was the vessel of something far less merciful. Either way, by the time the first guest sat down at Mrs. Renford's table, the meal had already begun. It began as tragedies often do, with celebration. Spring of 1931 arrived in Blackmere like a timid guest. Cool winds off the moor, thin sunlight on the hedgerows, and a faint scent of plum blossom winding through the crooked streets. The villagers spoke of renewal, of small mercies after another hard winter. At Renford Manor, the talk was of an anniversary, 25 years of marriage between Ada Renford, heir to a fading fortune, and her husband Charles, a former colonial officer who had returned from India with a limp and an affection for ritual. Invitations were written by hand, pressed with the family crest, and delivered by carriage to 11 of the county's most respectable names. The dinner was meant to reaffirm order, wealth, gratitude, faith. For 3 days, the manor stirred with preparation. Servants scrubbed the silver until it caught the light like blades. The great dining table, oak darkened by centuries of polish, was stretched to its fullest length. Florists from London sent sprays of white lilac and hothouse roses. But in the kitchen, beneath the hum of civility, something else simmered. Elsie Marrow, the quiet maid who had served the Renfords for nearly 2 years, worked alone. She refused help, claiming precision required solitude. When another servant offered to pit the plums, Elsie smiled politely and said, "They bruise too easy under strange hands." Witnesses later recalled that the kitchen that week smelled both sweet and wrong, ripe. Fruit tinged with something metallic. Mrs. Renford visited each evening to check progress. She adored her maid, called her our little blessing. When the lady once remarked that Elsie's preserves never molded, the girl only bowed her head and whispered, "Nothing spoils if you pray while stirring." On the night of April 17, 1931, the carriages arrived one by one. Lanterns swayed in the mist. The gravel drive gleamed like wet slate. Inside, the dining room glowed with candlelight reflected in the mirrored panels Ada Renford had imported from Paris. Guests took their seats according to a strict order of precedence. At the head of the table sat the hosts, smiling beneath a portrait of Ada's mother, a stern woman whose painted eyes seemed to follow the company. Elsie appeared only briefly, setting each course with practiced grace. Mushroom consommé, roast partridge, and finally, dessert. Small porcelain dishes of plum preserve crowned with cream. Several guests later described the moment in diaries and letters. Mrs. Torrington wrote that the dessert was the most delicate sweetness I have ever tasted, though it left the tongue oddly numb. Mr. Godfrey Lowe noted in his pocket journal, found after his death, that the preserve shimmered faintly under the light, as if glazed with frost. By midnight, laughter filled the drawing room. Music drifted from the gramophone. Ada Renford toasted her husband, thanking him for years of patience and the grace that keeps us safe. Elsie had retreated to the servants' quarters, folding aprons with mechanical calm. According to another maid, she paused once, listening to the laughter above, and whispered a single phrase, "It's begun." At 3:14 a.m., the first scream shattered the calm. Mr. Lowe collapsed in the corridor, clutching his chest. His wife followed minutes later, eyes wide, lips trembling, unable to breathe. By dawn, 4 guests were dead. The others reported violent chills, confusion, and vivid hallucinations, faces melting, voices echoing from behind walls. Dr. Elias Harrington, the local physician, declared cardiac arrest induced by extreme stress or shock. No signs of poison, no foreign substances. When the coroner examined the bodies, he noted a strange uniformity. Each tongue bore a pale white patch, almost translucent, like skin briefly touched by ice. News spread faster than influenza. The London Times arrived within 2 days, sending a photographer whose flashbulb burst against the gray sky. The headline read, "Death at Dinner, Blackmere's Curious Tragedy." Yet inside the manor, the mood was not of panic, but defense. Ada Renford refused to dismiss Elsie. "She is family," she told Inspector Harold Brandt, the young detective assigned to the case. "She prays for our souls." Brandt was 27, newly transferred from London. His reports, preserved in the county archives, reveal both skepticism and fascination. He described Elsie as a woman of uncommon stillness, neither guilty nor innocent, merely patient. When he questioned her about the preserve, she produced the recipe from memory: plums, sugar, lemon rind, and a single teaspoon of something she called white salt. Asked to show it, she led him to the pantry. The jar was empty, labeled in neat script, "Preserve number 13." Chemical analysis yielded nothing. No arsenic, no cyanide, no alkaloids. The preserve itself, what little remained, was analyzed in London laboratories. Results inconclusive. The texture, however, was unusual. Microscopic crystals within the syrup that refracted light like frost. Scientists dismissed it as sugar bloom. But Inspector Brandt recorded privately, "It glowed when the candlelight struck it. I swear it glowed." The funerals drew half the county. Blackmere's church bells tolled for an hour, their echo traveling through mist like a lament. Yet the villagers whispered that the dead had not died natural deaths. Old Mrs. Fenwick, who once taught Elsie her letters, told reporters, "She was touched, that girl, always listening where there was nothing to hear." Others spoke of seeing her walking barefoot at night toward the orchard, carrying a small jar and murmuring in Latin. The church itself divided. Reverend Patterson insisted evil had entered through temptation. The devil feeds on obedience, not rebellion. Meanwhile, Dr. Harrington wrote to a colleague in Oxford proposing a medical explanation, perhaps a rare bacterial toxin affecting the nervous system. His letter went unanswered. As rumors mounted, so did contradictions. A week after the tragedy, servants discovered that the portraits in the dining room, all 6 ancestral Renfords, had developed a faint discoloration across the lips, a whiteness like that found on the victims' tongues. The frames were sealed behind glass. No one could explain the change. Ada Renford had them covered with black cloths and forbade discussion. Elsie continued her duties. She cleaned, cooked, and attended church as if nothing had changed. The few remaining staff began to leave quietly, muttering that the kitchen air burned the lungs. Inspector Brandt visited again, hoping to provoke emotion. 4 people are dead, he told her. If you know something, anything, you must speak. Elsie looked at him with those still, unblinking eyes. Sir, she said softly, they asked for blessing. I only gave it. Brandt left shaken. In his notebook he scribbled a single line. Faith misapplied becomes science undone. Weeks turned to months. No charges were filed. The coroner's inquest ruled unexplained natural causes. The press lost interest. Yet within Blackmere time curdled. Cattle miscarried, wells soured, and every spring the plum trees blossomed early, then blackened overnight. Locals called it the Renford Blight, In 1932, a London chemist named Dr. Ivor Kane obtained a sealed jar of Elsie's preserve through a colleague at Scotland Yard. His diary, later recovered from his burned laboratory, contained disturbing entries. March 4th, substance unresponsive to heat, freezes when blessed with holy water. March 7th, taste induces brief paralysis, followed by vivid dream of a woman praying in darkness. His last note read simply, "The cold is spreading." No trace of Kane or his assistant was found after the fire. Back in Blackmere, Ada Renford's health declined. She grew reclusive, avoiding daylight, speaking only to Elsie. Villagers said the manor windows remained lit through every night, faint blue light flickering as if from a fire that produced no smoke. The constable who patrolled the grounds once claimed he heard singing from the cellar. Many voices, not two. Inspector Brandt returned a final time in late autumn. The trees were bare, the orchard silent. He found Elsie in the kitchen, standing before the empty shelves. "The jars were gone, everyone," she told him calmly. "It's finished. The recipe served its purpose." When he asked what that purpose was, she smiled for the first time. "To preserve," she said. Brandt pressed further. "Preserve what?" But she only looked toward the window, where frost had begun to form intricate white veins across the glass, though the night was mild. "Everything decays," she murmured, "unless you feed it something that never dies." He left without answers. His superiors closed the file soon after, citing lack of evidence and the Renfords' influence. Yet in his private correspondence, Brandt confessed to a colleague that he feared something elemental had taken root in Blackmere, that the girl's innocence was not pretense, but conduit. Theories multiplied over the years. Some claimed Elsie had discovered a fungal agent, a neurotoxin too subtle for 1930s science. Others insisted the explanation was spiritual, that the maid's prayers had turned sacramental, binding life and death in the act of preservation. A century later, biochemists still reference the Blackmere case in lectures about mass hysteria and placebo effects. But the villagers remember differently. They say that every generation or so, when the plum trees bloom white instead of pink, the air tastes faintly of sugar and ash. Dogs refuse to enter the orchard. Compasses fail near the old manor foundations, long since collapsed into ivy and ruin. A local folklore society interviewed surviving descendants in the 1970s. One, Margaret Renford Jones, recalled a family legend that Ada Renford begged Elsie to keep them safe forever during that anniversary dinner, that the maid obeyed too literally. Whether myth or memory, the effect endures. Blackmere remains absent from most maps, erased during wartime reorganizations. Yet hikers occasionally stumble upon the site. They speak of silence thicker than fog, of sudden cold, of the faint smell of cooked fruit where no trees remain. In the county archive, Inspector Brandt's last entry is dated December 2nd, 1933. It reads, "Return to kitchen. Jars absent, yet scent persists. The cold hums. If preservation means keeping, perhaps we are all inside the jar now." The line was underlined twice. And somewhere, among the forgotten files and yellowed clippings, lies a single photograph, blurry, grain-streaked, but clear enough to see a figure at the edge of the dining table that fateful night. 11 guests, 2 hosts, and a 12th shadow, pouring something unseen into the bowl of preserves. Whether that shadow belonged to Elsie Marrow, or to whatever she served, no one can say. But from that evening onward, Blackmere ceased to be a place on the map and became, instead, a question whispered in kitchens across England. What did the maid mix into her master's meal that made the living taste eternity? By the spring of 1932, the air in Blackmere carried the weight of something unsaid. The Renford tragedy had faded from the national papers, yet inside the village the story deepened into legend. Markets whispered it under breath, priests avoided the subject in sermons, and children dared each other to run past the locked gates of the manor at dusk. It was no longer merely a matter of poisoned fruit, it was becoming scripture. Elsie Marrow, the maid at the center of it all, remained a paradox. She continued to cook for Ada Renford, though no other household would hire her. Each morning she walked to the village grocer, shawl drawn tight, eyes downcast, and the crowds parted silently. Some crossed themselves. Others spat to ward off evil. Yet when asked directly whether they feared her, most villagers hesitated. "Not fear," said Mrs. Fenwick, the former schoolmistress. "Something worse. Respect." That respect was rooted in older soil than anyone wanted to admit. Folklorists who later studied the Blackmere archives noticed the language of gossip. Words like stirring, binding, blessing, and spoiling. They were relics of medieval superstition, phrases once used to describe the women called kitcheners, those who cooked not for nourishment, but for influence. In rural England, the kitchen had long doubled as an altar. Herbs could heal or harm. Recipes could act as prayers. The line between domestic service and sorcery was drawn thin as a knife's edge. When Inspector Brandt's successor reopened the case briefly in 1936, parish records unearthed an unsettling note, an entry from 1905, the year Elsie was born. It listed her mother, Margaret Marrow, charged and executed at Winchester Jail for healing without license, administering tinctures, and claiming communication with spirits through fermentation. The charge sounded quaint, but the implication was clear. Witchcraft disguised as herbal medicine. The execution had been one of England's last under archaic health laws. Margaret Marrow was hanged before dawn. Her infant daughter disappeared into the orphanage system. No wonder, then, that by 1932 the villagers began connecting bloodlines to blasphemy. They claimed that Elsie's jars of preserve were not recipes at all, but relics, containers meant to hold more than fruit. One rumor insisted each batch required a blessing whispered over boiling syrup. Another that she stirred counterclockwise 13 times to unbind decay. None of it could be proved. Yet in a community steeped in both church doctrine and superstition, proof mattered less than pattern. When the local vicar finally confronted her, it was not in anger but confusion. Reverend Patterson, weary and trembling, visited the manor one gray afternoon. His statement survives in church minutes. She offered me tea. I asked her if she believed the Lord guided her hands. She said, "Not the Lord you speak of, the one that listens closer." When I warned her of damnation, she smiled and said, "Then let him taste what I've made." The bishop ordered her dismissed from communion. Ida Renford refused. If faith condemned her, she wrote to the diocese, then perhaps faith has lost its recipe. The letter was never answered. As theological outrage grew, academic curiosity followed. In 1961, 3 decades after the scandal, a psychologist named Dr. Leonard Gray published Culinary Psychosis, The Case of Elsie Marrow. Drawing from surviving journals and testimonies, he proposed that the Maid suffered from a delusion in which cooking replaced speech. To those deprived of control, he wrote, ritual becomes language. The pot is confession. The spoon, absolution. According to Gray, Elsie's supposed miracles were manifestations of trauma. A child orphaned by execution, seeking to heal others by feeding them what she could not name. He called her condition communion transference, a need to merge the sacred and the edible. But the theory faltered when confronted with the evidence. Forensic reevaluation of residue found in the last surviving jar, sealed by a local collector, showed no toxin, yet contained trace isotopes of silver nitrate and sodium chloride in ratios not achievable by simple cooking. Under magnification, the crystals formed cross-shaped lattices, as if shaped by intention. Scientists shrugged. Historians whispered. The faithful prayed. What made her food dangerous? Was it chemistry or faith misdirected? To understand, one must remember the world she lived in. Between the wars, England was obsessed with purity, moral, racial, culinary. Housewives were told cleanliness was godliness. Servants were drilled in obedience. Every meal was a reflection of hierarchy. Perhaps Elsie, standing daily at the stove, watched power being served on porcelain and decided that flavor could be rebellion. Villagers later recalled that her dishes never spoiled, even without refrigeration. Some kept leftovers for days as curiosities, until the bread went moldy but the jam stayed bright as blood. When a curious doctor attempted to analyze a spoonful under heat, the metal warped. He threw away his notes. "Best not meddle with blessings," he muttered. In the 1950s, folklorist Eleanor Ridgway interviewed elderly residents for the BBC's Voices of the Vale. One old gardener described sneaking into the kitchen after hours. She'd be talking to the pot, not mumbling, proper talking as if someone answered. The air'd go cold near her elbows. "Smelt of rain, though we was indoors. I told the mistress once," she said. "She's praying." Well, maybe she was, but the Lord never. Answered in Latin far as I know. Recordings of that interview were archived under domestic magic, a term now used by anthropologists to describe how faith and daily labor intertwine. Elsie's legend became a textbook example. Religion domesticated into ritual, superstition sanitized by service. Still, something darker pulses beneath the analysis. Hidden among Ada Renford's surviving papers, a set of kitchen notes bound with twine, lies a page headed Preserve Number 13. The handwriting is Elsie's, meticulous and calm. Beneath the ingredients she wrote in pencil, "Take and eat, for this is remembrance." Scholars argue whether the line reflects blasphemy or devotion. To believers, it mimics Christ's words at the Last Supper. To psychologists, it reveals delusion, a servant imagining herself as savior through sustenance. Yet others perceive intent more chilling still. If preservation meant salvation, perhaps decay meant damnation. Perhaps her victims were not chosen at random but offered, kept, not killed. After all, their bodies showed no rot for weeks, embalmed by an inexplicable cold. Parish burial logs note that frost formed on the coffins even during warm days. To modern theologians, the Blackmere case stands at the intersection of sin and sanctity. Was Elsie a heretic reinventing Eucharist in her kitchen, or a mystic channeling ancient agrarian rites the Church had long suppressed? The old word witch may be too crude. She might have been a philosopher in apron strings, attempting to bind spirit to matter with sugar and prayer. Consider the testimonies of those who tasted her cooking and survived. Two servants sent away before the dinner tragedy later described sensations of quiet euphoria, a feeling of being seen entirely. One claimed that for days afterward, her dreams were filled with light, so white it hummed. To skeptics, these were symptoms of suggestion. To believers, evidence that Elsie's food fed not the body but the memory of grace. Even decades later, culinary historians exploring pre-war recipe books find marginalia, tiny crosses, numerals, and Latin abbreviations, identical to Elsie's style. Some suggest she was part of a secret circle of domestic mystics, women exchanging coded blessings through cookbooks when open ritual was forbidden. The theory remains unproven, but the handwriting comparisons are eerie. In the late 1990s, genetic testing on artifacts from the manor revealed microscopic traces of human DNA embedded within residue from preserved fruit. Forensics couldn't identify the source. Degradation was too advanced. Conspiracy forums seized on the finding, claiming human ash had indeed been an ingredient. Scientists dismissed contamination. The debate continues, feeding digital folklore the way gossip once fed parish pews. Every generation reinvents Elsie Marrow. To filmmakers, she is the tragic servant saint. To skeptics, a psychotic woman whose trauma fermented into myth. But in the quiet libraries of Oxford and Durham, theologians note an older pattern. Across centuries, whenever belief fractures, someone tries to taste certainty. Monks distilling relics into tonics, widows baking communion bread in secret. Perhaps Elsie was part of that lineage, an alchemist of faith seeking preservation not of flesh but of meaning itself. The deeper one reads her story, the harder it is to separate holiness from hunger. Feeding is an act of mercy and dominance alike. Every spoonful says, "I decide what enters you." In that sense, the kitchen becomes confession, and the cook a god of small worlds. If Elsie believed she could redeem others through food, then the deaths at Renford Manor were not murders to her, but transformations. The white marks on the tongues? Communion's final signature. Still, the question lingers. Did she know what she was doing? Her surviving statement to police contains one haunting line. When asked if she regretted the dinner, she answered, "Regret spoils the batch." Today, historians tour the ruins of the manor, now little more than stones choked by ivy. They note that nothing grows where the kitchen once stood. No weeds, no moss. Soil samples show unusually high salinity, as though soaked in brine. Visitors describe a faint sweetness in the air, metallic and cold. One researcher left an open jar of sugar overnight. By morning, it had crystallized into perfect hexagonal forms. She sealed it in glass, labeled it Specimen 13, and refused to keep it indoors. Faith, folklore, psychology, and chemistry all attempt to decode the same paradox. How intention alters matter. Elsie Marrow stands at that crossroads. To touch her story is to taste the thin boundary between prayer and experiment, blessing and curse. The villagers once said she stirred with both hands, one for God, one for whatever listened beneath. Maybe that's all witchcraft ever was. Perhaps the real horror of Blackmere is not that Elsie poisoned anyone, but that she revealed how fragile our divisions are. The priest and the scientist both mix ingredients hoping for transformation. One calls it miracle, the other medicine. The outcome depends only on faith. And somewhere, buried beneath the collapsed stones of Renford Manor, lies a cellar lined with broken glass jars. When the moon is high, locals claim, a pale mist rises from that ground and settles over the orchard like breath. It smells faintly of plums and of something sanctified, If you listen closely, you might hear the echo of a spoon striking the side of a pot, a slow, steady rhythm, a prayer, a warning, or perhaps simply the sound of preservation continuing, long after the cook has vanished and the faithful have forgotten what they were fed. When the spring of 1934 crept over Blackmere, it brought with it a heaviness that even the wind seemed to avoid. The air was too still, too aware. After 3 years of whispers, death, and unanswered questions, the town awoke to the sound of the church bell tolling at dawn, not for Sunday service, but for Mrs. Ada Renford herself. The woman who had once hosted glittering dinners beneath chandeliers now lay motionless in her bedroom, her face serene, a faint residue of plum on her lips. On the dresser beside her bed sat a small porcelain dish, licked clean. Beside it, an open jar labeled in careful handwriting, Preserve Number 13. Inspector Harold Brandt, who had thought the case buried under official silence, returned to the manor by noon. His boots echoed against the marble floor as he crossed the grand hallway. The house, once vibrant with chatter and the clink of silver, was now consumed by an unnatural hush. The curtains were drawn, but sunlight still seeped through the edges, falling on dust motes that floated like tiny ghostly witnesses. Brandt's first impression was of order. Everything was too neat. The table in the dining room remained set for one, a solitary breakfast untouched except for the empty jar and the faint, sweet scent of burnt sugar lingering in the air. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, no forced entry. Only the sense that something had been waiting here, quietly, and had finally completed its work. He found Elsie's apron folded with military precision on the kitchen counter. It was spotless, as if she had taken time to wash, press, and smooth it before leaving. The apron's pockets were empty except for one item, a slip of paper, thin as onion skin, with writing so small it almost seemed carved rather than penned. It read, "She fed them what they asked for, though they did not know the hunger." Brandt pocketed the note and continued the search. The manor staff, those who remained, could offer nothing. The gardener had last seen Elsie 2 nights prior, walking toward the orchard with a lantern. The cook's assistant, trembling, said he heard humming, a lullaby without words, echoing from the cellar long after midnight. And Mrs. Renford, according to the housekeeper, had grown increasingly erratic in her final days, muttering about recipes she didn't remember writing, about names she hadn't spoken in years. By evening, Brandt ordered a full search of the property. Constables combed the orchard, the stream, even the churchyard. But Elsie had vanished without trace. Her room contained only a bed, a single dress, and a small wooden box that held 2 objects, a rosary missing its cross and a glass jar lid engraved with the number 13. The autopsy on Mrs. Renford revealed nothing extraordinary. No poison, no trauma, only a faint discoloration on her tongue. The coroner called it vascular fatigue. Brandt called it nonsense. He'd seen that color before, in the victims from 3 years prior, and he remembered the strange coldness around their mouths, the way the air chilled in the morgue when their bodies were unwrapped. He reopened the case officially on April 3, 1934. His notes from those days, later recovered in fragments, tell of his growing frustration and obsession. He recorded each interview with precision, yet the handwriting itself began to change, tighter, more erratic, the letters slanting upward as though pulled by invisible tension. One entry stands out, April 10th. The kitchen hums when no one is near it. I stood by the stove and felt a pulse beneath the floorboards, like a heartbeat muffled in stone. When I closed my eyes, I could smell sugar burning. Not the acrid kind, the sweet one, like fruit on the edge of decay. I think she knew something about transformation. Not death exactly, more like refining, turning what's impure into something that can last. Locals avoided the manor. They said the air around it felt dense, that compasses spun near the orchard, and that their horses refused to cross the lane after dusk. The rector attempted a blessing, sprinkling holy water along the kitchen threshold. Within an hour, the silver basin he used had tarnished black. Brandt, however, refused superstition. He wrote, "The mind craves reason where none exists." And yet as days passed, even he could not dismiss what he felt. He began sleeping inside the manor, convinced Elsie would return. He kept the jar, preserve number 13, locked in his satchel. According to his later notes, the contents were gone, but the glass emitted a faint warmth whenever he held it, as though something once alive clung to its walls. On the 15th of April, the night before he was due to leave, Brandt reported a dream. She stood at the stove, back turned. Her hair was unpinned, The pot was boiling, but no fire burned beneath it. I asked what she was making. She said, "Memory." When she looked over her shoulder, her eyes were hollow, but the reflection in the pot showed a different face. My own. He awoke drenched in sweat. When he reached for his satchel, the jar was open. Inside, faintly etched in condensation, was his name, Brandt. He never filed this finding. The official record shows no mention of it, but the entry was confirmed decades later when his diary was discovered in the archives of the Kent Constabulary. Historians and forensic analysts verified his handwriting and the existence of the jar, which remains missing. By the end of that year, Blackmere had emptied. Families sold their homes for a fraction of their worth. The manor fell into disrepair, windows shattered by storms, roof beams collapsing inward like a dying lung. Children told stories of a woman seen near the orchard, her apron glowing faintly under the moonlight. Some said she was still cooking, stirring invisible ingredients into the mist, whispering the names of those who had eaten her food. A decade later, a chemical team from London conducted soil tests around the manor. They reported unusual crystallization patterns beneath the kitchen floor, traces of sodium carbonate and calcium that didn't match any known contaminant. The area where the stove once stood registered temperatures several degrees lower than the rest of the building, even in midsummer. Priests who returned to consecrate the ground found the same problem. The holy water froze upon contact. One of them, Father Hensley, later confessed, it was as though the kitchen itself refused forgiveness. The final section of Brandt's journal, presumed written weeks before his disappearance, carries an uncharacteristic tone, neither investigative nor professional, but confessional. I no longer believe she poisoned them. I think she fed them, something from beyond herself. The deaths were side effects, not intentions. She believed hunger was spiritual. Perhaps she thought she could fill what God left empty. If so, she succeeded. We ate what we could not comprehend, and it is still consuming us. After that, Brandt's handwriting falters. His last line is almost illegible. The recipe was never hers. It only needed her hands. He was never seen again. His personal effects were found months later in a railway locker, uniform, notebook, satchel. But the jar was gone. In the years that followed, Blackmere became a ghost town. The manor burned partially in 1941 during a lightning storm, though no rain fell that night. Locals claimed to see smoke in the shape of a woman's silhouette drifting above the ruins. In 1967, when developers attempted to rebuild on the site, the lead architect abruptly quit, citing recurring dreams of a kitchen that breathes. By 1989, paranormal researchers filmed a short documentary titled The Blackmere Preserves. During their overnight investigation, they recorded fluctuations in temperature and captured a faint female voice on audio, repeating the phrase, "Take and eat, for this is remembrance." The words matched the marginal notes found in Elsie's recipe book, now held under lock at the British Library's restricted collection. Modern psychologists studying the case coined the term marrow syndrome, a rare form of dissociative ritual fixation where an individual channels obsession through repetitive acts of care, blurring empathy with control. But even they admitted something in the evidence resisted explanation. One researcher, Dr. Eliza Keene, wrote, "If this was madness, it was methodical. If this was faith, it was precise. Whatever force guided her, it understood hunger better than any human ever could." The final government report, filed in 1991, officially declared Elsie Marrow missing, presumed dead, but the file remains open under anomalous investigations. The preserved samples from the original 1931 dessert, found years later in a sealed pantry jar, were tested under modern conditions. Results showed no toxins, but the sugar crystals contained microscopic organic residues resembling neural tissue. The discovery was quietly suppressed. Today, the ruins of Renford Manor lie beneath ivy and silence. Tourists rarely visit. Those who do report feeling a strange pressure in the air, as if the atmosphere itself thickens the closer they stand to the kitchen's foundations. Some claim to smell plums. Others say they hear the soft clink of spoons against porcelain. And at the heart of it all, one question still lingers like an aftertaste. What if Elsie Marrow never vanished at all? What if she simply became the hunger she tried to satisfy, forever feeding, forever remembered, in the kitchen where faith and fear first shared a meal? Because perhaps she was never a murderer. Perhaps she was a mirror, reflecting the oldest truth in mankind, that what we crave most is often what destroys us. And somewhere beneath the soil of Blackmere, where the ground still smells faintly of fruit and ash, the recipe waits, not for discovery, but for remembrance. For nearly a century, the story of Elsie Marrow has fermented like the preserves she once made, sealed, sweet, and quietly rotting beneath the lid of history. What began as a police file in 1934 has become an obsession shared by historians, psychologists, paranormal researchers, and culinary scholars. Yet the more each tries to dissect her, the less they find. Facts dissolve into folklore, evidence into echo. Some say Elsie was England's first modern serial killer, a cunning servant who used her employer's kitchen as a stage for silent murder. They see no mystery, no witchcraft, no higher calling, just a young woman with intelligence, access, and opportunity. In this version, the preserve number 13 was nothing more than a poison cleverly disguised in sweetness. Her victims, wealthy, entitled, and complacent, never suspected that the same gentle hands serving them were sealing their fate with every spoonful. Detective journals from the 1950s revived this interpretation. A criminologist named Arthur Penley argued that Marrow was an alias, her true identity belonging to a nurse dismissed from St. Catherine's Infirmary in 1928, after multiple patient deaths went unaccounted for. He cited handwriting similarities between hospital records and Elsie's recipe margins, proposing that her so-called rituals were merely her method of precise dosage control. His essay, The Gentle Poisoner, Anatomy of a Myth, became a minor academic sensation, yet even Penley admitted that some facts didn't fit. The lack of toxins in the victim's systems, the chemical impossibility of the scald-like markings on their tongues, the strange cold around their corpses. If she killed, Penley wrote reluctantly, she did so with a substance that has never existed in the known world. Other scholars turned to faith and folklore for answers. In 1963, historian Clara Renford, a distant relative of the original family, published The 13th Supper, a study exploring the religious undertones in Elsie's notes. She argued that preserve number 13 referred to an old rural superstition, the 13th meal, prepared not for the living, but for the souls of those lost. In pre-Christian England, it was believed that a cook could invite a spirit into communion by offering food infused with a personal belonging, hair, ash, or bone dust, of the deceased. The ritual was meant to bring peace to the wandering dead, though it was later condemned by the church as necromantic. Renford's theory found eerie support in forensic re-examinations from 1978, when the residue from one of Elsie's preserved jars was analyzed using electron microscopy. Trace minerals resembling calcium phosphate, the same compound found in human bone, were detected. The findings were dismissed as contamination, yet the stain of possibility never washed away. Around the same time, folklorists began collecting oral histories from Blackmere's surviving elders. They spoke of Elsie not as a murderer but as a healer. The last of the Kitcheners, as one old woman described her. These were women said to cook emotion into food, stirring love, protection, or forgiveness into their meals. They were half witch, half mother, one villager explained, the kind who made bread that could comfort a grieving heart. If such legends held truth, then perhaps Elsie's preserves were attempts to cure a sickness not of the body, but of the soul. And yet every cure has its cost. By the 1980s, the story had split into two camps, science and superstition, each fiercely defending its own recipe for truth. In the realm of science, the culinary psychosis theory gained traction. Dr. Peter Halloran, a clinical psychologist, proposed that Elsie suffered from a form of delusional altruism. She believed, he wrote, that feeding others could redeem sin, her own or theirs. When her meals failed to bring spiritual transformation, she perceived their deaths not as failure, but ascension. His paper, The Servant God Complex, argued that Elsie's killings were ritualized acts of control disguised as compassion. In contrast, theologians saw something deeper, perhaps darker. Reverend Nicholas Gray, writing for the Journal of Sacred Abnormalities, declared that Elsie's recipe resembled a corrupted form of Eucharist, a false communion in which the flesh becomes the flavor. He quoted her marginalia, "Take and eat, for this is remembrance." To Gray, that single phrase proved intent. She was not imitating the divine, he wrote. She was replacing it. Then came the modern era, an age hungry for spectacle. In 2002, a television crew from the BBC commissioned an experimental documentary titled The 13th Jar. Their goal, to recreate Preserve No. 13, using only ingredients listed in Elsie's surviving recipe book. The head chef, a molecular gastronomy expert named Daniel Crowe, insisted the experiment was purely academic. Filming began inside a controlled studio kitchen in London, with every step monitored by both scientists and historians. The ingredients seemed ordinary: plums, sugar, vinegar, and a dash of salt. Yet as Crow began stirring, crew members noted a strange metallic scent rising from the pot. The studio's temperature dropped suddenly by several degrees, though no air conditioning was active. Cameras captured condensation forming on cold metal surfaces, and microphones recorded a faint hum, rhythmic, almost melodic. When the preserve was complete, Crow volunteered to taste a single spoonful. The cameras rolled as he brought it to his lips. The moment he swallowed, the lights flickered. Power across the entire block failed for 90 seconds. In the darkness, one camera continued recording, powered by an internal battery. The footage, later analyzed, showed Crow standing motionless, eyes closed, whispering, "She's still hungry." When power returned, he was unharmed, but shaken. He refused to speak about what he'd experienced, later withdrawing from public life entirely. The BBC never aired the episode. Officially, the footage was lost in post-production. Unofficially, fragments circulate on underground forums, grainy clips showing a jar bubbling as though alive, and a voice, faint but distinct, humming that same wordless lullaby once described by Mrs. Renford's staff. Paranormal investigators soon swarmed Blackmere. Between 2005 and 2015, at least 7 separate research teams conducted night vigils near the manor's ruins. The most notable, Spectral Archives UK, recorded sudden electromagnetic surges and unexplained temperature fluctuations, drops of 10 degrees within seconds. In one session, an investigator placed a sealed jar of store-bought jam on the kitchen's foundation stone. Within an hour, the glass fogged from inside, and a faint number, 13, appeared on its surface before vanishing. Skeptics dismiss these findings as coincidence, group hysteria, or deliberate hoax. Yet others argue that something far older than Elsie is at work, that she merely tapped into a current that predates Christianity, perhaps even civilization itself, the human belief that food connects the living to the dead. Indeed, across cultures, offerings of sustenance are ancient acts of remembrance. From Roman funerary feasts to Celtic soul cakes, the boundary between nourishment and necromancy has always been porous. Elsie Marrow may simply have followed that line too far, seeking to feed spirits, not people, until the two became indistinguishable. In recent years, a new generation of digital sleuths has reignited the myth. Reddit threads dissect every diary fragment, every blurred photograph of the manor, every inconsistency in police archives. Some claim to have found coded recipes hidden in the original case notes, numerical patterns that correspond to biblical passages. Others argue that preserve number 13 was never food at all, but metaphor, the 13th attempt at creating immortality through memory. Each person she fed, one commenter wrote, became preserved, not dead, but stored. In 2019, culinary historian Dr. Maid released a controversial book titled The Taste of Remembrance. She proposed that Elsie's preserves may have contained psychoactive compounds derived from fermented nightshade berries, which could induce vivid hallucinations and temporary paralysis. Alder speculated that the victims experienced death-like symptoms while their consciousness underwent extreme spiritual delusion. They may have believed, she suggested, that they were dying, and so they did. Her work sparked outrage among theologians and fascination among neuroscientists. Some praised her for grounding myth in biochemistry. Others accused her of desecrating the sacred. The BBC revisited the story that same year in a 3-part docuseries, Blackmere, The Feast of Shadows. The final episode ends with an ambiguous statement. Whether she served poison or prayer, Elsie Marrow fed something that still has not finished eating. And perhaps that is the truest horror of her legacy. Not the deaths themselves, but the persistence of appetite. Every theory, every experiment, every whispered retelling keeps the story alive, as though by speaking her name we continue her ritual. The people of Blackmere, what few remain, refuse to discuss her openly. They say the ground remembers, that if you stand by the manor ruins at dusk and listen closely, you can hear a spoon stirring against glass, slow, patient, endless. Some tourists who visit the site leave small offerings of fruit or bread, as if to appease the invisible host. Others take soil samples only to find them oddly sterile, incapable of sustaining plant life. A local legend claims that once every 13 years the air in the valley turns sweet, like sugar melting on a hot pan. On those nights, animals avoid the orchard and no one dares to cook. Even now, Elsie's story divides those who study it. To skeptics, she remains a product of hysteria and coincidence, an ordinary woman caught in extraordinary myth. To believers, she is something else entirely, a vessel chosen by hunger itself, the kind that exists not in the stomach, but in the soul. Either way, the tale endures because it satisfies something fundamental. It feeds our need to believe that behind every act of kindness might lurk a hidden motive, that sweetness can conceal something unspeakable. It reminds us that what we consume, stories, faith, food, becomes part of us, shaping the unseen chemistry of our fears. And perhaps that's why, even after all the investigations, documentaries, and dissections, no one has ever truly answered the simplest question. What exactly was in preserve number 13? Was it poison or prayer, madness or mercy? Or was it something we still don't have words for? A recipe written not to kill but to remember? Because maybe the secret ingredient wasn't in the jar at all. Maybe it was in us, in our endless hunger to taste the unknowable, to believe that some stories are too real to forget. And so, as long as there are those who whisper her name, who stir their tea and think of the girl who cooked for ghosts, Elsie Marrow's legend will continue to simmer, gently, eternally, just beneath the surface of belief. No body, no confession, no proof. Only the lingering taste of a story that refuses to fade, like sugar clinging to the rim of a forgotten jar. Nearly a century has passed since Elsie Marrow vanished, yet in Blackmere, silence still hums with her name. The manor stands hollow now, its kitchen windows glazed with dust instead of steam. But every autumn, when the fog drifts low and the trees begin to rot sweetly, villagers say the air carries a faint scent. Strawberries, perhaps, or sorrow. To some, Elsie was a victim of loneliness, a woman so consumed by the hunger for connection that she poured her own soul into the act of feeding others until it became lethal. They imagine her, pale in the candlelight, stirring jam with trembling hands, whispering blessings she did not understand. Her preserves were comfort and curse alike, her only language of love and her quiet undoing. To others she was something far darker, a trespasser in divine territory, a woman who tasted what mortals were never meant to know. Priests of the old parish warned that she had fed what should not be fed. Scholars of folklore argue that she opened a spiritual wound through her cooking, a doorway where grief, memory, and hunger bled together. For them, Elsie was neither evil nor innocent, merely human. But in touching the infinite, she became something else. Science as ever arrived too late. Laboratory reports spoke of contamination, of chemical traces that made no sense for their time. Rational minds declared it poison, though no one could prove its source. Even today, forensic experts who re-examine the records are left unsettled. One researcher described her findings as a recipe written in 2 languages, one chemical, one emotional. And still, faith argues. Priests call her sin a warning. Psychologists call it projection. Storytellers call it tragedy. Each theory devours the next, as though the mystery itself must keep eating to stay alive. Maybe that's what she discovered. Not a supernatural truth, but a terrible metaphor. That love, too, can consume. Perhaps the answer was never in the jar. Perhaps it was in the hearts of those who tasted it. The loneliness that made them seek comfort in something warm, something sweet, something that felt like being remembered. After all, not every ingredient can be found. Some are taken, some are given, and some are never meant to be swallowed. In the end, the kitchen remains. The dust lies thick, the shelves bare. But if you listen closely, you might hear the faint clink of glass. You might even smell something familiar, sugar, smoke, and the ache of memory. And somewhere, beyond reason or faith, the story of Elsie Marrow continues to simmer. Quiet, patient, waiting for someone else to take a taste.